Hey gang, welcome to the Replace University podcast. I'm your host, Michael Lush, and sitting alongside me is my guest today, Lance Welch. Lance is the author of this book that I just finished actually this morning, right before talking to him. And when I say finish this book, again, you guys probably already know, in all transparency, I did not read this book. That's why the pages are perfect in it. I downloaded it off of Audible. It's more efficient for me to do. So I want to, if you don't mind, I want to read your bio so that people can get familiar with who you are and your background.
Okay.
Lance is obviously an author, speaker, and business coach. He is a veteran leader primarily of the financial services space. Before going out on his own in 2018, he was a VP of sales for a Fortune 100 company. Lance is also a husband of over 36 years, has 3 grown sons and 2 grandchildren. With the travel schedule he kept while with corporate, he became very intentional when investing time with his family. This is what led to his first book that was just recently released. And again, it is the Legacy Navigator, Creating Intentional Multi-Generational Impact. Welcome to the show.
Love to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So again, in all transparency, I actually met Lance before. Met you a few times. One when over at working with Taylor.
Yep.
And then I think that was the first time. And then again, just at a hotel, you were sitting down with Chris Robinette, who's our financial planner.
Yep.
And then this is the third time.
Yep.
So I know his son better than I know Lance. His son's Taylor is a very successful entrepreneur himself, and I've known Taylor, I guess, since 2015 or 16. Robinette had recruited me to convince him the benefits of whole life insurance.
Yep.
Yeah, I would imagine you probably told him too.
I did.
But just like I can remember the conversations with my parents. They could tell me things all day long, but if I heard it from a third voice or second voice, then it clicked. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And I go home and tell my parents, like, check this out. And they're like, yes, actually what we've been telling you for a long time. So I know the feeling now that I have boys. So you've got 3 boys.
Yes.
Taylor, Peyton, and Logan.
Yes.
I don't know Logan. How old is Logan?
He's 32. So they're 35, 32, and 30.
Oh, okay.
And Peyton just got married this last weekend.
Yeah, I saw that.
So they're all off the market. So he is in a Caribbean island. I probably shouldn't tell where he is. But he's been sending pictures back, saying, pray for us, this is rough. We're roughing it down here. And sends a picture of the beach and the crystal clear water.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah, just rub it in.
Yeah. All right, so one I want to talk about, because when you talk about leaving a legacy, in my opinion, it's not just starting with your children, it's having a teammate. And you've had a teammate in your wife for 36 years.
Yeah.
In this day and age where divorce rates are where they are, what has been your secret to a loving relationship for 36 years?
Well, the 36 years of loving relationship was kind of an exaggeration. It's probably been 34 of those.
Yeah.
Right? So she would tell you it's because I'm very coachable.
Okay.
Right? But just like everything else, someone asked me, how would I sum up the book? Mm-hmm. One word, intentional. Mm-hmm. So even with the marriage, we were incredibly intentional about making the marriage work.
Yeah.
And we just did an event recently, and one of the things, even at my son's wedding, one word I told him to never use is the D word.
Yeah.
And so we made a commitment very, very early on that word just wasn't going to be used.
It's not an option.
Right. And I remember hearing a quote from, I don't even know if it's a true story, but someone asked this couple that had been married 65 years, how have you been married for 65 years? And her answer was, son, we got married in an era when something was broken, you just fixed it.
Yeah.
You didn't throw it away. So that's kind of been our mantra, just fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no option or exit strategy.
No.
It's you just got to figure it out. It's funny because this is the first time you and I have talked about this, but that is not exactly, but pretty close to what me and my wife have talked about too. It's like, that's not going to come up. That's not an option. So if we have disagreements or issues or personality conflicts, then we need to sit down and talk it out. And those talks are not always going to be convenient,
right,
or nice or comfortable, but they're necessary.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that. All right. So as a father of 5 boys, you have 3 boys. Your 3 boys are successful. Mine are quite a bit ways behind, my oldest being 12, so I've got a long ways to go to really, I guess I should be intentional and concerned about it now. And I try to, but they just have different interests and different personalities right now. So what were you, when you say being intentional, was that something that you learned along the way, or was it something that on the onset you're married and you're like, we're going to have kids, and I figured this out already, or was it just something that you learned along the way?
Definitely learned along the way. I've always been an avid reader. John Maxwell is my personal mentor. I'm a coach in his organization. So I started following him in the late 80s, and that really kind of got me going as far as transferring leadership. The company I was with, typical of large corporate fashion, they recruited a lot of leaders, basically throw them up against the wall, see who sticks.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to develop as a leader, you had to do it yourself. So I started hiring a coach probably back in the 90s, before that was really a popular thing.
Yeah.
So my sons got to see that. They got to see me pulling coaches in, paying consultants just to be a better leader at a corporate level. Then I read a book, which is a great book for dads with sons, called Raising a Modern Day Knight. If you've never read that, I would make that in your top 1 to 2 list.
Yeah.
But it's about transferring boys to manhood.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic book. It's now, and it's probably its 5th generation of reiterations. But they did a lot of groundwork on transitioning from age 13 and beyond. And so you're right at the cusp of that.
August, it'll be 13.
There you go. And so that was really where it started, is we were intentional on what we did. And a lot of the stories are in the book as far as what we did. I think the precipice of being intentional, my wife actually came up with, and that was with 9/11. If you remember that story in the book, we were concerned, maybe she was concerned, how were they going to process what happened?
Yeah.
And anytime you say 9/11, if you're in a large group, you're going to read body language. You're going to tell that it hit a chord. So she was concerned about how they'd process it. I went out and bought a chimenea. I don't know if you remember what those are.
Yep.
The old version of a fire pit.
Yep.
And we learned right then that if we provided food and fire, the boys would sit and talk for hours. If my wife just wanted to sit down on the couch and talk, she'd have them at 30 seconds, 60 seconds. So that was what was kind of the aha moment for us, is got to get to their level. You got to figure out what interests them. And with 5 kids, they're all going to be different. My 3, totally different.
Yeah.
So I was visiting with a dad today. He's got 5 kids. One just turned 13, and he's like, our interests aren't identical.
Right.
So what do we do? So you just got to get out of your way and to get into their world.
Yeah, I don't want to consolidate all of your time selfishly solving my problems as a father. We will get into the book, and then, there are some, obviously a lot of financial things in here, but it's way more. Like when I first got into it, I knew Lance's background, I knew his son's background, so I'm thinking this is going to be heavy financial, but it was way more than just financial. So you're talking about sitting down with your sons and just talking. So it's not being distracted by something else. You got fire, food, and you're talking. Yeah. So one thing that we recently did is we took all the TVs away, all of them. Like during the NBA playoffs, it's more of a punishment to me than it is my wife. I was a basketball player, so I'm big into basketball. And I'm like, it's the NBA playoffs, and now you take the TV away. So we don't have any TV, and it forces us to have conversations, to play board games, et cetera. So what did y'all do to, just boys are different than girls, and they should be. It's the way God made us. But, I've got a niece that used to live with us I'm very close with, and man, they're the same age as my 7-year-old, and they're just totally different. It's easier to talk to my niece than it is my 7-year-old.
Interesting.
My 7-year-old only wants to talk and not listen, and he can't sit still. He's bouncing off the walls. He's hyperactive. So what did you guys do to just keep that focus? Was there no TV, or was there certain strategies?
Well, there was definitely TV, but not to the level that we even have access to it now. Internet wasn't near the thing 30 years ago as it is today. One of the things that, even the concept of the book is talking about the legacy table. So my wife had always said, no matter what they do, no matter what the decisions they make, they're always going to have a seat at our table. Yeah. And so from that precipice of there's 4 legs to a table, that's where the 4 legs of the legacy table came from. And all the years that I was in financial services, it was the majority of every conversation I had with those families was, how do we offset taxes, or how do we create a reservoir of cash to pay for the taxes? Right. There was never a real conversation of, how do we transfer the wealth? How do we make sure it goes beyond 3 generations? How do we make sure that we create legal documents to make sure they don't have access to it? Right. But what I found was, when we focus on vision, values, and knowledge, and transferring those 3 things, being able to transfer the wealth is the easiest to address.
Yes, yeah, I gathered that. It's kind of tees up one of the case studies that you were talking about in the book. And again, you got to read the book because this is going to be super high level, and there's some golden nuggets in this case study that Lance is going to talk about. But there was this one gentleman, and if I remember correctly, because this was towards the beginning of the book, had a net worth of $150 million and had 2 sons. And
three kids, 2 boys and a girl.
Yeah. Okay. And you were trying to, or the siblings had approached you, and you're trying to set up a strategy so that the inheritance, 50% of it didn't go to the government.
Right.
They didn't become one of the heirs. And it was almost kind of like a hostile environment where he didn't so much care. He's like, look, I came from nothing, actually less than nothing, I think is what you said.
Exact words, yeah.
And, so why should they be given a spoon on a silver platter? I'm paraphrasing here. So there was a lot of contention there. So can you kind of speak to not so much the financial aspect of it, because we'll get into that, but just how there's a totally different aspect here that there's more than just money in a legacy. Like obviously they didn't have everything dialed in when it comes to relationships as a family. So that's why there was that contention there.
Yeah.
So can you add more color to that?
Yeah, that was in the late 80s, and back then it was a 50% tax bracket for anything over $5 million. So that $150 million, roughly $75 million was going to the government. Mm-hmm. That concerned the kids.
Right.
And so they brought me in to talk to them about setting up trusts, and I wasn't an attorney, but I worked with them. And so the conversation was really short. He was courteous, he was kind as far as letting me visit. Mm-hmm. But after I shared with him what the concern was, that's when he came back with, I started with nothing, less than nothing. So the fact that they're going to end up with about $25 million apiece is not my problem. So the value of relationship just wasn't there.
Right.
It could have been handled a whole lot differently. When I relayed that back to the children, they did have some choice words about their father. So part of it would look like, well, that sounds like entitled, spoiled brats. But when you really looked at it, the guy's business was very inventory heavy. Mm-hmm. It wasn't cash.
Right.
So they had to start liquidating stores for them to be able to make the IRS bill.
Oh, I see.
So they didn't have the money. They
Right.
had inventory, had assets, buildings, real estate. And you know what happens when you're forced to sell real estate quickly.
Yeah.
You don't get the top dollar.
Right.
So it was an unfortunate, but it was another great lesson that you get to see that, money can be very divisive.
Yeah.
But one thing that I am proud about this book, though, is it doesn't matter if you have a $5 net worth or a $500 million net worth.
Right.
Your legacy is your name.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how much your net worth is. But if you have net worth to talk about, there are definite strategies you can go in without having to lean on just pure legal docs to make it work.
Yeah, it's one of the things, obviously I'm preparing for when I'm not here, and for my wife, or, she's younger than me, female, vegetarian, probably going to live longer than me. So I'm financially preparing for it, but what I'm most concerned about is the traditions, the values, the pass down of knowledge, the mistakes that I made that I don't want them to make. And, easier said than done, because, they're at an age where, especially the 12-year-old about to be a 13-year-old, he's already got it figured out.
Of course. And he will until he's 25. And then
and I'm
and
I was the same way. I can't judge it because I was the same way, if not worse. I mean, my mom was a financial planner for 42 years. My dad was an entrepreneur. Now, having said all that, they didn't have money until I was in college. So people think because of what they eventually accumulated, that I was born into that and we were wealthy. No, we struggled all the way up until I was probably a sophomore in college. I was already off payroll. Now, there was definitely some opportunities that they helped out with and gave me some guidance. But yeah, along the way, I mean, that's the epitome of who you could turn to for advice. But, call it immaturity or just being hard-headed. I had to hear it from somebody else other than them.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to get my boys to understand, is the most valuable thing I can give you is not to do with my business, because they may not even want to run this business. Heck, it may not even be around by the time they're old enough to run this business, or they're skillful enough to run this business. It's knowledge, it's the mistakes, it's the mentors, it's the coaches, it's the masterminds that I attended. Those little nuggets can put them on the fast track to where they want to be.
Yeah.
And, the other thing that we've had conversations about, I was forced into athletics, and I played every sport that was offered and eventually excelled at it enough that I could get college paid for. But through that process, another thing I learned was I don't want to force that on them, because we came from a baseball family, and it was like, okay, you're going to be a Major League Baseball player. Your grandfather was, your dad's a baseball player, your brother was an all-state baseball player. This is what you're going to do.
Right.
And it was because that was their dream. And it wasn't mine. I got burnt out on it and eventually turned to another sport that I excelled at. And so I don't actually push them into sports. I let them gravitate more towards it. So now that I've blabbed all of that, how do you get hard-headed, knuckle-headed boys to really listen to you? I mean, does that start all the way from the point that they're born and how you nurture them and care for them and how you talk to them? Because I'm a human and I have tons of fallacies. I get short-tempered at times. It's like, I told you 3 times, do it this way, and you still didn't do it this way. Now look what's happened. And, so I've got a lot of room for improvement. So obviously the fruit of what the seed you've planted has bared fruit, and your boys are amazing. I only know 2 of them. I don't know Logan, but I know 2 of them, and they're amazing men. So was that something over the process, or was that just, you mentioned being intentional, but it's...
Yeah, it was definitely intentional. Even when they turned 13, if I went to a leadership event, or if I went to speak at an event, I would take them out of school and take them with me. Mm-hmm. So I began to expose them to leadership. My goal was not that they would ever be intimidated by people with money or in the leadership or dressed better, whatever. Right. I wanted them exposed to it early. Yeah. So I took them out of school. We homeschooled for a good long while, but then once they were in school, and interestingly, the school thought that I was harming them because I was taking them out of school. They were unexcused absences, and so, which it is what it is. But that was part of the intentionality piece. This weekend was a real epiphany. I learned a couple of things because I got to officiate Peyton's wedding, which was very interesting. But I had some downtime. There was a beautiful creek that was running through the property where we were, and I was able to sit out there and do some journaling and just reflecting, on the weekend. And one thing that it hit me, we talk in business a lot about lagging indicators. Yeah. And in business, a lot of times if you run ads today, you're going to see results next week. Right. If you start networking, you might see results in 60 days. So there's always a lag that we're used to in business. What I felt impressed in my mind this weekend was, as fathers, our lagging indicators may be 1, 2, maybe 3 decades long. Oh, wow. So the things that we did 20 years ago, oftentimes I would remember thinking, my wife and I would, I don't know if we're getting through to them. I don't even know if you watch their eyes and their body language, that just bounced right off. Yeah. But what I got this weekend was it mattered. Everything that you do matters. And it plants a seed so that you will be reaping fruit 10, 20, 30 years from now. The other thing that sticks out to me is the older the boys get, you will transition from the heavy hand of dad to more of a coach, consultant, to now friend. Yeah. And watching that transition, I got to see it this weekend. It was amazing. Yeah. So one thing that I will encourage you now is the older they get, the less they're going to need to be fixed. Right. They don't want to be fixed. And I feel like I had a strong moment a few years back with some decisions one of the boys was making I strongly disagreed with. Yeah. And I pushed him away so hard because I was doing everything I could to fix him. Right. And what I honestly felt like it was a God message that said, no relationship, no influence. And from that moment on, when I started working on purely relationship with the adult men in my household, it's amazing to see what has happened now. And to watch the relationship they have with their mother, that's what really triggers me. So you are at this stage where you're still the heavy hand of dad. They still need that direction. Right. The older they get, you're going to begin to transition, and you're going to turn into that coach because you coach people all the time. And sometimes you have to remove yourself from the father-son relationship and realize I will get more done with him by coaching than dictating. That is a very good point.
So back to the golden nugget is no relationship, no influence.
Correct.
Yeah, boy, I want to write that one down. Okay, so I know that you guys normally tune in because this is Replace University and 90% of what we do is financial related. So let's go ahead and knock that out for you guys. But for me, it's more important is the other things that we talk about as far as the 4 legs. So the 4 legs, if you could label those out for us.
The first one is transfer of vision, transfer of values,
Right.
transfer of knowledge, transfer of wealth.
Right. So on the wealth side, if I remember these statistics correctly, in the second generation, 70% of the wealth is gone, and by the third generation, it was 90%.
That is correct.
Okay. Because that, I think, was towards the beginning of the book, too. So
Right. Another interesting thing from a statistical perspective, you remember the study we talked about in the book where there's what percentage of families have a basic last will and testament? The study was several thousand families, $4.5 million net worth and above, and 54% of them had no basic planning.
Wow.
Now you get into, I think it's care.com, and they open it up and there's no net worth requirement. 68% of that group had no basic planning, no last will and testament. So those documents aren't that hard, but a lot of times it takes a relationship with you or someone else that would direct them. It's like, this is just the basics.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just about to ask that because we have a living will and we have a trust in place, and it's been years. So when I say years, probably 8 or 9 years. But I remember the will being pretty simple. Like we knocked that out in a day or 2.
Correct.
One day of thinking about it, another day talking to an attorney and getting it knocked out. The trust, however, was very difficult for us because it was questions that needed to be answered that we had never thought of. Like, I'll give a hypothetical scenario. Wyatt turns 25. I'm no longer here. Maybe Mal is or isn't, but there's an inheritance and it unlocks a certain portion of the wealth. Well, let's say Wyatt is addicted to cocaine and now he can get $500,000, $1 million. That could be a death sentence.
Correct.
And there was little questions like that were asked to us that I was like, man, I never thought about that. God willing, that would never happen, but you got to think about those things. And that's why the trust portion was so tough for us to go through. Have you got exercises or advice of how to not properly set up a trust, but just things to think about from a family relationship standpoint that can make that path easier than it was for us?
Yes and no. For decades, I worked in that space. And that was probably the number one conversation that all these families have is how can we protect the assets from harming our kids? There are no shortages of ideas and strategies to restrict access.
Right.
College degree, advanced degree, married, not married, run-ins with the law. I mean, you run the gamut on how many restrictions you can place. What this premise is really taking a totally different perspective. You're not going to ever get away from those things we've just talked about.
Yeah.
But when you spend, especially at the age that you are with your kids, when you spend an inordinate amount of time on what is the family vision, and you teach them how to think for themselves, kids, even adults, don't understand the power of strategic thinking.
Yes.
And critical thinking. When you're raising young people to think for themselves, it's a double-edged sword because you want them to do that. And then when they turn teenagers and they start thinking for themselves, that frustrates you as a parent. But that's what you're raising them to do.
Right.
You're training them to launch. But when you spend an inordinate amount of time about this is our family vision, these are our family values. There's a value exercise in the back of the book that is just fantastic. It's real easy to describe, very difficult to actually implement.
Right.
But when you do that, once the kids start getting into teenage years, you, as a dad, I hope, well, you won't. You don't dictate that their values are identical to yours.
Right.
There's 150 values in the back appendix, and they're all good. So I don't care that their 5 don't match mine because they still picked 5 on their own. And you know what happens when they pick their own?
They take ownership.
They own it.
Yep.
So when you really focus on the vision and the values, and then kind of a missed one is the transfer of knowledge, because there's things that you're going to be doing by the time that maybe they do want to come into the business,
right,
that you take for granted because you've been doing it for 4 decades.
Yeah.
And so that's where the intentional transfer of knowledge comes in. And The thing, you remember the family in Rhode Island that had the 44,000 square foot
Yes,
home?
I wanted to bring that up just for my own edification because it was on the Atlantic coast, right?
Yeah.
Overlooking the Atlantic coast. I'm like, 44,000?
It was so gorgeous.
That's 44 times the size of my house now.
It was gorgeous, but it was multi-generational. That house had been in the generation for four decades or 4 generations.
Right.
Had at least a half dozen businesses in different industry.
Yeah.
And the kids oversaw over those businesses in the different industries. So they were very, very intentional to make sure that they were in the meetings, they learned how to receive opportunities, how to discern threats, what to do with them. Those kids actually had on-the-job training for 2-3 decades before they had to take over.
So essentially what you're saying outside, and we want to get to family meetings because that's one of the main things that I want to do inside of my own family too, is if you take care of the first 3, then the 4th one becomes easy.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or let's say easier.
Yeah.
Gary Keller's book, The One Thing.
Yeah.
So it's the same basic premise. If you find one thing that drives an inordinate amount of results, you need to spend more time on that one thing because it makes everything else easier. Doesn't make it easy. You still got to get to work.
Got it. All right, so that was the 4. If we could summarize wealth, that becomes easier because of the vision, the values, and the traditions, right?
Knowledge.
Transfer of knowledge. So if we could summarize vision, how do you do that?
For me, it's a scriptural context,
Yeah.
right? Without a vision, people perish. The way to put it is without vision, people go astray. They get off track. Well, you got to know what your track is before you can stay on it. So for me, vision is just having an idea of where you're going and why.
Okay, easy enough. And then we get to the second one.
Which is values.
Right.
Values is one of those things that I always think of it almost like integrity. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one's looking. So what does your values dictate?
Right.
What do you stand for? What makes you stay up at night from a positive, not from worry or fear? John Maxwell talks about what makes you cry. What do you have such a passion for that it just grips you and you're ready to do something about it? So that's your values.
Yeah, and that's helped us out in this business because our consultant Ryan, you probably know Ryan Adele.
Yeah.
So we've had him for 2 or 3 years, and he had us do a mission statement and our values, our core mission, our core values as a company. And that has become our guiding light in making decisions.
Absolutely.
And there's been some opportunities that if you take out the value piece of it, you look at it like that's a no-brainer. Take advantage of it. But when you incorporate it inside of what our core values were, it didn't make sense for us. We didn't take advantage for better or worse. There was one scenario that on the face value, we're like, this is a no-brainer. We should take advantage of this. It was buying out another company, but it didn't meet our core values. So we said no. And then you fast forward 6 months down the road, some other things started coming through from that other business that was like, oh my goodness. We didn't know it at the time. God thing. We made this decision financially. In fact, we even had one of our consultants be like, yeah, you need to sign a letter of intent ASAP. And it was just something in our guts. It was just like, just doesn't fit with what we're doing and what we're trying to do. And so we passed on the opportunity, and then 6 months later, it imploded. And that would have been our problem to deal with. It was a legacy, quote unquote legacy, no pun intended or pun intended. It was a legacy issue with that company that had we taken over, could have became our problem and a big problem that could have really taken down both companies.
Yeah. Well, think about the practice, though, you just talked about. As a company, you have a mission statement.
Right.
You have your core values. This is one of the things that really started even the family vision cast that's in there. The thing that started that is at the end of every year, the company I was with, they had us do an end of year review.
Right.
I basically just took that corporate end of year review, changed the verbiage to make it highly personal.
Right.
And that became our family vision cast. So at the end of every year, we did a corporate one, and then we did one with the family. And we did that for probably over 20 years on an annual basis. And the last 2 years, the boys, they brought girls with them and got to invest in some women, young ladies, because having all boys, it was a totally different deal.
Yeah.
So even I see so many business owners, they're so good at running a business. If they would take that same intentionality and running a business well, convert it to a personal side, bring those values into the home, I think they would see drastically improved results within the household.
I'm going to prove to you that I'm a slow learner. So read the book and even knew that aspect of the book from Chris, prior to reading the book, and it was like, yeah, I want to incorporate that. But now it just finally clicked for me. Now that you're saying it out loud in front of me, we have off-site meetings every 90 days. So we got to get outside of this atmosphere. We go somewhere, maybe a cabin in the woods or whatnot, and we map out the next 90 days.
Yeah.
And then we do an end of year one. It's kind of in November, but then we look at, let's say 2024 or 2025, and we try to map out the entire year. Like, this is what our big audacious goal is for the year.
Yes.
And it's like, oh my goodness. Imagine if you did that just as a married couple, right. let alone kids, or even sat down with, then you add on to it, all right, let's sit down with kids. Next 90 days, what do we want to do as a family? What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to get better at? How do we want to grow?
Yep, so good.
Yeah, it is. Duh, it's right there in front of you. I mean, you do it professionally, why don't you do it personally? It's like, essentially that's what we did with Replace Your Mortgages. We took corporate finance. I was a corporate finance major in college and then went on to McCall School of Business. And it was teaching how businesses finance things. And I was like, oh my goodness, well, why can't we do that on a personal level? And I was the mortgage guy. So that's how actually it was a hedge fund manager. It kind of really was the catalyst for it. But then I was like, this makes sense personally. So same aspect here. A lot of things that we do professionally, we do. We take for granted. We do it and we're intentional from a business standpoint because we're greedy or we focus too much on money, and then we really slack on what's most important, which is personally. So I want to make sure that people caught that though. So you have 2 family meetings every year.
Yes.
One is based on relationships, personal growth, et cetera, and one is a corporate one. So can we talk about the...
Yeah, let me give a website. There's a couple of free downloads.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is what we just now talked about, is the Family Vision Cast.
Right.
So that's thelancewelch.com/family vision.
Mm-hmm.
The other one, and that's the annual, that's once a year, usually it's between Christmas and New Year's.
Right.
On occasion, it might have to go into January.
Just because it's convenient, you're already all together.
Right.
Okay.
The other that is on a monthly basis is just me and my wife.
Oh, okay.
And we call that one First Friday. So it's not real creative. Mm-hmm. Guess what day of the month we do it?
Yeah, the ends and why.
We do it first Friday of every month. That one is also out there on the website, but it's just called thelancewelch.com/First Friday. Mm-hmm. This is the one that we started also over 2 decades ago because of the company I was with. I traveled 6 and 7 weeks in a row every 2 months. I was just gone all the time. So when I was home, I was, like I said, very intentional. Mm-hmm. One of the things is just I wanted to make sure that my wife and I were on the same page. Mm-hmm. So we lived on the golf course, and we went to the restaurant at the golf course because it wasn't crowded. But the first Friday of every month at 2 o'clock, I'd kick out of the office, and most of my income was overrides, not salary. So by then we had the month-end reports, and I was able to show my wife, this is what you can expect, deposit in 2 weeks. We'd look at the last month's calendar, we look at the upcoming month's calendar. We would get on the same page with budgets. On about once a quarter, we would actually look at balance sheet or vacations or whatever it was. But that one is the one from a couple's perspective.
Yeah.
I highly encourage couples to do it. Get a sitter with the kids, and it's every month. First Friday. If it has to be a Saturday because you both work, who cares, right? But make it very, very intentional and get on the same page, and then have a very nice dinner.
Yeah, to kind of celebrate.
Absolutely.
So you're putting in the hard work. Doesn't necessarily have to be hard. It can be fun, especially depending on the type of relationship you have with your wife. But then you put in the work, and then you have fun. So in our offsite meetings, there's sometimes, like for instance, we'll go to the lake. Boat's there, it's gassed up, it's got the toys on it. It's got the cold water on it, ready to go. And we're like, all right, can't touch it. There's things that we have to tackle. Yes. And it keeps us focused on, all right, you can't do that, because if you do that, then we'll procrastinate. We'll get back to this. You also lose focus and clear-headedness and all that. So that is one thing that we do. Now, there was a family, because there's guardrails around family-owned businesses too. Can you talk to that? So let's say you have a business and you want the younger generation to see this, to understand how decisions are being made, but there's guardrails around it at these meetings. Can you talk to some of those guardrails? Yeah,
what you're really referring to there is where there's a family business and the children are in the business or could potentially want to be. One of the requirements that we had is we would have the children be there, but unless they had an actual leadership designation,
Right.
they were there to listen.
Right.
They were there to take notes and feel free to ask questions, but they were there to just begin to learn how to even read a balance sheet or a P&L. How many people can even balance a checkbook today, let alone
Right.
a balance sheet or a P&L or getting into some of the trust documents. So those are the ones where they're just expected to be an adult. You treat them like an adult, and they're showing up. They dress appropriately, which obviously the attire today is so different than it was 20, 30 years ago. So that's the reason I'm still wearing a jacket. It's just kind of a habit.
I completely rebelled. I used to be, 11 years ago, clean shaven, 3-piece suit, because I had to. That was just kind
Market
of
dictated it.
also, my senior vice president dictated it too.
Yeah.
It was also the culture as well. I mean, we were in Matt, who I think you met. He's our COO. We worked at the same company right out of college, and it was who could dress the nicest. And so, it was a requirement. You had to wear a tie, but it was the senior vice president would have a tailor come into the office once a month and be like, "Oh no, you need a new suit. You need a new suit." There was a whole strategy behind this too, because if you spent your money on cars and suits, then you had to perform really well the next month in order to afford your bills. So he was a smart man. But I rebelled against that. I said, once I started my own company, I'm going to own the company. It's not going to own me. And I'm like, I'm just going to be myself. So I grew the beard out. I wear a ball cap 90% of the time and T-shirts, and very rarely do I dress up. So it is a different culture these days. So when can they actually speak up? As you said, when they have a leadership position or they're an adult, like if let's say they're 17, but they're not in the business in a leadership role, they don't have the ability to speak?
Not during the meeting.
Right.
And I've been a part of other meetings where it was definitely multi-generational.
Yeah.
They could be in their 30s.
Yeah.
And they don't get to speak.
Okay.
So if you've
it's
got
not an age limit or requirement.
If you've got a patriarch, and again, that's one of the things that we're seeing some changes. A lot of the patriarchs don't feel the next generation's capable of taking over.
Yeah.
And as long as they don't release control and train them now, they're going to be 100% right. I think did you ever see the movie Tommy Boy?
Yeah.
So I reference that a lot because Tommy was not ready, but he was never invested in to be ready.
Right.
So if you have a strong-armed patriarch or matriarch that isn't willing to release control, you might have a 30-year-old that, their 50-year-old parent barely has a voice, which means them at 30, they definitely don't have a voice. But what they are still learning is how does the business work? Yeah. Those folks, they know how to make money. They know how to perpetuate wealth. And when you are raised up in that environment where you know how to create net worth and improve it, then that's why I say you have less of a concern of what does the trust document say?
Right.
What restrictions can we put in? Because the expectation now is not only can you manage it, you can grow it. Right. And that doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah, that is actually a much harder task. I say that. It was tough doing this, and again, we're small potatoes compared to the families that you worked with, but it was tough. I actually heard somebody talk about, I think it was Ed Milet, it might have been Brad Lee, that was talking about your first $1 million is going through the fires of hell. Yeah, and it really was. And then your next $3 million, a little easier than the first, and it just gets easier and easier and easier. Now, once he got past that certain million mark, I won't say what it is. I don't know anything about it yet. I can't relate, but I'm looking forward to it being easier. So, all right, well, cool. Well, we're about to wrap up here. I know you got a call with another family to work with. And any parting nuggets in the book that you think that we should be talking about or that the audience should know?
Well, someone was asking me the other day if I could sum it up, and it was intentional, but I think the other word would be consistency. Yeah. Because, I look back and I could probably write a book of all the mistakes we made as parents. But one thing that we was intentional and consistent. And I am now under the belief that intentional and consistency will trump all the mistakes that I made. So the things that we were doing on an intentional basis, the desired outcome was strategic thinkers, for them to be able to think for themselves. And I look now and my sons are some of my best friends. Yeah. But they can also call me out. Right. They can challenge me if they hear me, because I'm really big on words. And not the word try. You've used it a couple of times. Yeah. That's not a good positive word.
That's
but
true.
Don't use try, don't use need. And so when I digress and I use that word, we have the type of relationship that they can call me out.
Yeah.
So that's where I was looking at this weekend. The relationships that we have, that is a 30-year lag. That's one of the encouragements I would give any parent, regardless of net worth.
Also, one thing that seems to be resonating with me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is you talked about being intentional and consistent. And at times they may not have listened to what you were saying, but your actions obviously was something that was indelible in their mind and was now that you're starting to see the fruits of that. It's like they saw what Daddy was doing.
Yeah. Well, there's a quote in the book, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, what you're doing is so loud, I can't hear what you're saying.
Dang. That's another good nugget. Good job, man. I like that.
It's not mine. It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, awesome. I appreciate you coming in. Again, this is the book, The Legacy Navigator. You pick it up on Audible or Amazon. And also, if you do pick it up, please leave a review. If you read it, I'm going to do that. I just read it this morning. I'm going to leave a review. A truthful, it's obviously positive because this is a really cool book. But please do that. It helps out the book, helps out his rankings and whatnot. We'd like to see him become a best-selling author, especially right out of the gates with his first book. So appreciate you guys doing it. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Lance.
Thank you.